The literary simple past tense in Italian explains completed actions that are fully detached from the present. Unlike the simple compound past, this tense shows events as finished, closed, and historically distant, so there is no present relevance, known in Italian as passato remoto. The function of the passato remoto is to narrate historical events, tell stories in literature, and explain completed actions in a remote past. In other words, it's a simple past tense that's very common in written Italian, specifically in literature, but it's still used in speech in some regions. In general, it's rare but stylistic in spoken Italian, and even though you may not use it in conversation, it's good to know for the comprehension of formal Italian. In the remaining videos on the Italian pasts, I will mainly cover the grammar and semantics of the tenses. If you're interested in reading Italian literature, the examples in this video will be helpful, but the emphasis is on meaning. Because the passato remoto is a simple tense, there are no auxiliaries, past participles, or agreements, so its formation will simply have different endings for every conjugation. Again, if you're interested in reading Italian literature, this will be helpful, but if you learn to speak Italian, this information may not be that relevant. For are verbs, remove the ending from the infinitive and add the literary past tense endings, using the verb parlare, to speak, ending in are. Parlai, parlasti, parlò, parlammo, parlaste, parlarono. Now we can see a different category of verbs, like ere verbs. Here we have to consider two conjugation patterns, because one uses more formal endings while the other has a shortened pattern that's very common. Let's see the first pattern with the verb credere, to believe, ending in ere. Credei, credesti, credè, credemmo, credeste, crederono. This is the first pattern for ere verbs, but we can also see the second pattern, which is very common in high-frequency verbs, or verbs that were not regular in Latin. We can see the pattern with the verb mettere, to put, ending in ere. Mettetti, mettesti, mettette, mettemmo, metteste, mettetero. At last, we can see the last category of verbs, which is ire verbs, and these have one pattern. Let's see the verb dormire, to sleep, which ends in ire. Dormii, dormisti, dormì, dormimmo, dormiste, dormirono. So, this is how regular verbs get conjugated in the passato remoto in Italian. However, this tense also has irregular verbs that have essential forms, which are fixed for reading Italian literature, meaning that literary Italian heavily relies on third-person forms, like the pronouns lui, lei, and loro. On the screen, you can see the most common verbs that have irregular conjugations in the passato remoto, and many irregular verbs shorten their stem, double their consonants, or add a vowel in the third-person singular form. Assuming that the focus is on speaking Italian, as opposed to reading Italian literature, I choose not to go in depth about why the tense has so many irregularities. These forms often come directly from Latin perfect tenses, so these verbs perfectly explain why reading Italian is literary, because it's made for narrative comprehension. The passato remoto is mainly about historical writing, so it's not necessary to say it all the time. For the most part, this is done in the context of reading Italian literature, if you're interested. Nonetheless, In southern Italy, this tense is still used in speech, while in northern Italy, it's mainly written or historical. At the same time, the complexity of the tense is morphological and not syntactic, so it has no auxiliaries, participles, or agreements. As a way to conclude the lesson, we can see examples that are typical in simple narratives with common literary patterns, and such sentences show completed actions, narrative sequences, and events that are perceived as distant and closed. Il re entrò nella città. The king entered the city. Un giorno vide una luce lontana. One day he saw a distant light. Quando arrivò la notte, partirono. When night fell, they left. Appena fu pronto, uscì di casa. As soon as he was ready, he left the house. La battaglia finì all'alba. The battle ended at dawn. Overall, this is how the passato remoto fully works in Italian. It expresses completed actions in the distant past, and it's mainly used in literature and historical narration. Alongside, it's common with third-person forms, and it has many irregular verbs, but with no auxiliaries, participles, or agreements. In modern speech, it's rare, but remains regional.